In the vastness of space where giant starships floated between glowing nebulae and powerful empires, ruled entire systems through bloodlines and superior genes, there lived a man named Darren who worked as a mechanic at an old worn-out space station. Near the edge of the regulated zones, he had no known family, no prestigious bloodline, no certificate of enhanced intelligence or engineered strength. He was born naturally on Earth, raised in an overcrowded dome city, and had left his home in search of freedom among the stars. But even light years away from Earth, the shadow of his birth followed him like a silent insult in the minds of those who believed themselves better. The galaxy's elite had grown used to thinking of humans as laborers, nothing more than a basic species useful for maintenance, mining, and other low-rank work. They used polite words in public forums, but behind closed doors and under their breath, humans were called things like lowborn duskin or genome trash. The high-blooded species of the Central Alliances saw themselves as evolved, as chosen by science and destiny to lead and rule, and among them, sharp-tongued and haughty noble woman known as Alira often made a game of mocking Darren whenever she passed through the station. Alira belonged to a dominant house of the species that was tall, silver-eyed, and enhanced at birth through centuries of strict genetic control. She wore long robes of glowing fibers. Her voice was smooth like metal, but carried the chill of ice, and her every word was measured to cut without effort. Whenever her luxury vessel stopped for fuel or maintenance, she would step onto the station with disdain in her eyes, and when she saw Darren, she would smirk and speak loud enough for everyone to hear. "They allow this creature to touch the engine core," she would say with a fake laugh. "No wonder the old ship shakes like a leaf." And others around her would chuckle, though some of them looked down in shame, for they had seen Darren's work. They knew he repaired things others couldn't. He understood machines not just with tools, but with feeling, as if he could sense what was wrong by the way the metal breathed. But none of that mattered to those who judged by lineage, not by effort. What no one knew, and what Alira tried hard to forget, was that several years ago, when a group of raiders attacked her diplomatic cruiser near a forbidden system, it was Darren who had risked his life to pull her from the wreckage. He had carried her across a broken oxygen corridor when others had fled, and had stayed by her side in the med bay until the crew arrived. He had asked for nothing in return, not recognition, not reward, not even a thank you, but something had happened between them. In those days, something strange and unplanned and impossible to explain. For a short time after the rescue, Alira had begun acting differently. She had returned to the station a few times without official reason, and Darren, who never expected kindness from her, had found himself speaking with her late at night beside the cooling fans of the power cores. They spoke of stars and silence and regrets, and she never called him lowborn in those moments. But the moment passed, and the visits stopped, and Alira returned to her world of polished halls and perfect genes, and Darren returned to his tools and wires. Months later, in secret chambers on her homeworld, Alira gave birth to a child. She had no partner to claim the bloodline, and the genetics showed a strange blend, a human signature that couldn't be erased or masked. The council elders of her house advised her to dispose of the child quietly or send it to an off-world facility for reclassification. But Alira made a different choice, driven perhaps by fear or shame or something else. She left the child on a neutral science colony under a false name and told no one, not even the father. Child named Kale by the station's eye records had large eyes and strong limbs, and grew faster than the scientists predicted. He showed no weakness of immune system, no learning delay, and instead absorbed knowledge like heat in a furnace. He was silent for long periods, then suddenly would speak full sentences beyond his age, and when upset, strange pulses of energy would make the lights flicker in the lab. The scientists kept him under observation, but no one questioned his presence. Too closely back on the edge station, Darren heard whispers from a passing trader of a child on a science colony with strange talents who didn't belong to any known race. Something in those words caught in his chest like a broken wire. He asked for coordinates. made excuses for leave and took the long road through half-regulated lanes and old driftways, until he arrived at the colony where he saw the boy through a glass panel, and without needing proof, without needing papers or explanation, Darren knew this was his son. Scientists were hesitant. At first they quoted protocols and regulations and clearance levels, but Darren did not raise his voice. He simply sat and waited outside the lab day and night, fixing broken panels and sweeping the walkways, until someone noticed his quiet devotion, and slowly the walls came down and the boy was allowed to walk with him and talk with him. And when Darren finally took Cale in his arms, the child did not cry or question. He simply rested his head on his father's shoulder, as if he had been waiting his whole life for that moment. From that day forward, Darren no longer worked on ships for pay. He lived on the colony and spent his time teaching Cale about engines and stars and kindness. He built small machines for the child to take apart and put together again, and each time Cale did so faster and better than before. Darren never spoke of bloodlines or honor. He never mentioned Alira or the past. He only said that people are more than the codes they're born with, and the stars don't care who your ancestors were, they only care who you are when you stand beneath them. What began as mockery had set into motion, something no one could stop, and as the boy's eyes turned to the stars, something ancient stirred in his blood, something greater than pride or pain, something waiting to rise. Years passed on the quiet science colony, where the boy Cale grew taller, stronger, and more curious with each cycle. His mind absorbed information like the endless sky drank sunlight. His hands moved with the precision of someone far beyond his age, and his thoughts reached into places most adults could not understand. Yet despite all his gifts, he remained distant from others. The researchers called him special. They used words like anomaly and breakthrough, but they never looked at him like a child. Just a subject in a study, always watched, always tested, never truly accepted. And though he never said much about it, Darren could feel it in the silence that followed his son's quiet footsteps. Darren did what he could. He built a small home from scrap modules near the edge of the colony, where the winds were stronger and the stars clearer. He crafted learning tools with hidden games, puzzles that taught gravity and light through play, and he always made time to sit with Cale, even if it meant fixing things late into the night. He told stories not of great warriors or noble bloodlines, but of wanderers who made their way with grit and heart, and every story carried the same truth, that greatness had nothing to do with where you came from, and everything to do with what you chose to become. Cale listened more than he spoke, but he remembered everything. One evening, as the moons rose over the ridge, he asked his father if it was true that people like him did not belong anywhere. Darren looked at the sky, then at his son, and said, "The stars are full of places waiting for someone like you. They just don't know it yet." And Cale nodded, as if that answered everything he had ever wondered. Not long after, Cale met another child named Lyra. She was part of a transport convoy that had stopped for emergency repairs. Her hair shimmered like copper under the twin suns, and her eyes were too sharp for someone her age. Darren noticed she never stayed still, always glancing over her shoulder and keeping distance from others. It did not take long to find out she was like Cale, unwanted, forgotten, and carrying secrets about her origin that no one dared to speak of. Darren offered her shelter, a place to stay, until her transport returned, but the ship left without her, and no message ever came back. Soon after Finn arrived, a quiet boy with pale skin and a way of hearing sounds no one else could hear. He was found wandering outside the colony perimeter, confused and barely speaking. The scientists tried to examine him, but he would not allow them near. Only when he saw Cale and Lyra did something shift in his expression, as if he recognized something he had never seen before. A reflection, a connection without words. Darren took him in two, and without any formal decision, the three became a family, bound not by blood or law, but by something deeper. They grew up side by side, learning together, building strange devices from spare parts, testing their limits in the empty fields outside the colony. Cale could see energy patterns in malfunctioning machines, Lyra had reflexes faster than the colony guards, and Finn could sense when storms would arrive days before the satellites picked up signals. They were different, and the colony began to notice. Some whispered that they should be reported to the High Councils. Others feared what they might become, but Darren stood between them and the outside world like a silent wall. He made it clear that these children were not tools, not problems, not threats. They were people with hearts and minds and dreams of their own. One day a visitor arrived, a man in a dark flight suit who claimed to be a scout for the Galactic Frontier Corps. He had heard rumors of unique children on the colony and wanted to observe them. He watched from a distance, took notes, asked questions that seemed simple but were not. Darren did not trust him, but did not stop him either, because he had a feeling something bigger was approaching, and soon enough it did. The children were invited for an off-world evaluation under the name of a peaceful scientific exchange. Darren knew the truth beneath the polite words. They were being tested not just for science but for use. After long talks and careful thought, he agreed to let them go only if he could accompany them and be present at every step, and the Corps agreed, not because they respected him, but because they feared losing the opportunity entirely. They were taken to a secret facility orbiting a gas giant, a place hidden from most maps and protected by layered security, and there the testing began. But it was not what Darren expected. It was not just intelligence or strength or speed. The examiners were looking for something else, something deeper. They ran emotional simulations, exposure trials, high-pressure decisions that revealed character more than capability. What they found shocked even them. Kale, Lyra, and Finn outperformed every known metric, not just in power but in unity. They did not compete, they completed one another. Where one struggled, the others filled in. Where one failed, the others lifted without being asked, and it became clear they were more than individuals. They were a system, a formation that could operate beyond orders and beyond fear, something the Corps had never seen before. And then came the turning point. A high-level officer revealed that the children's unique balance of human and high-blooded genetics made them naturally resistant to advanced forms of psychic manipulation, a defense even the strongest of the elite could not replicate. They were immune to control, immune to certain forms of influence used by rising threats across the galaxy, especially the one known only in whispers as the Hollowburn, an artificial species growing in the shadows of Warno. The children were no longer just curiosities, they were seen as potential weapons. Darren could see the change in how the officers spoke, how they watched them like assets instead of guests, and he felt a cold knot in his chest. He had brought them here to show the galaxy what humanity could become, not to see them molded into something he never wanted. But the children had seen the truth too. They knew they were different. They knew the world feared them, and yet they stood together not as soldiers, but as a family stronger than steel. The facility offered them training and resources and a path to positions of power within the Corps, but only if they accepted full control over their missions and their lives. The choice was not easy, but the children chose on their own terms, and Darren respected it because he had raised them not to obey, but to decide, and they decided to shape their own future. Back at the colony, whispers began to spread about the three hybrid youths who were growing into something beyond classification, and the man with no pedigree who had raised them without titles or riches, only truth, patience, and the strength to believe in those the world had thrown away. Years passed quietly, but not without purpose. The three children, now grown into young adults, had transformed into something far beyond what anyone expected. Kale had developed a unique awareness of patterns. He could predict the flow of energy, sense changes in ship systems before they failed, and track enemy movement without using scanners. Lyra became a master of reactive combat. Her body moved faster than her thoughts, as if instinct had merged with foresight. And Finn, whose quiet nature never left him, had learned to bend sound itself to his will. He could detect the faintest signals, feel pressure shifts from incoming ships, and even mimic voice commands with precision. Together, they formed a unit within the Galactic Frontier Corps, but their missions were not ordinary. While others were sent to secure borders or escort convoys, The trio was dispatched into gray zones, unregulated sectors, and deep space. Ruins where normal teams had failed. The Corps did not announce their names or show their faces. They were kept in the shadows, classified, even to commanders. Their operations were codenamed Phoenix Echo, a term whispered in the darker corners of military networks and feared by rebel factions who believed they were ghosts sent by the universe to reset the balance. Darren remained close to them, not as a superior, not as a soldier, but as their anchor. He lived aboard a mid-tier support vessel, converted into a mobile base, and kept it maintained with the same quiet focus he had always shown, while others saw legends in the children. Darren still saw Kale holding a broken circuit board at age 6, or Lyra staring at the sky wondering if her mother would ever return, or Finn whispering his first full sentence after months of silence to this galaxy. They were powerful beings, but to him they were still his children, still learning, still human, while the children carried out missions. Across distant systems, a silent storm was gathering. Something ancient and engineered was rising from the lost corners of galactic history. The Kaleidson, Holoburn, once created by the elite bloodlines as adaptive tools of conquest, had evolved beyond their control. Without warning, they began to eliminate entire colonies, removing all life in minutes, leaving behind no bodies, only silence. They operated without emotion, without warning, and most terrifying of all, without any way to stop them. Traditional weapons failed, psychic defenses collapsed, and command structures fell into confusion as the Holoburn moved with perfect coordination. Whispers spread that they were looking for something or someone, a frequency or signal that only certain minds carried. Some believed it was a flaw in the old elite genetic lines. Others said it was a mutation created by accident, but the truth was simpler. The Holoburn was searching for anything outside the expected pattern, anything that could not be predicted or controlled, and Kale, Lyra, and Finn were exactly that. They were not bred within a system or filtered through generations of precision. Their existence was unplanned, their strengths unmeasured, and their bond unbreakable. The Corps began to understand this pattern too late, and by then several high-level stations had already fallen. The 3 hybrids were recalled to a secure command center orbiting a red dwarf, where surviving officials debated how to use them as a last measure against the growing threat. The room was full of uniforms and titles, but the words felt empty to the trio, who had seen more truth in broken worlds than in grand speeches. When asked what they needed, Kale simply replied, "We will go where they are. We will find what they fear, and we will stop it." But before they could move, a new crisis unfolded. Darren had gone silent. His last known signal came from a way station near the outer rim, a place known for being quiet yet unstable. When Kale received the message, he said nothing for a long time. He just stared at the screen, his jaw clenched, then turned to Lyra and Finn, and they all knew without speaking that this mission would not be like the others. The Corps tried to stop them, claiming they were too valuable to risk, but the trio ignored the orders and left in a stealth craft powered by modified drives built by Darren himself. They traced the signal across nebula storms and fractured space until they reached the old way station. It was empty, cold, powered down, but still holding trace signals. They searched for hours until Finn picked up a weak pulse buried deep in the structure. Not a distress call, but a trail left behind on purpose inside a sealed room. They found Darren bruised, but alive, guarded by a Holoburn sentinel that did not attack immediately. It just stood watching, unmoving, as if waiting for something. When Kale approached, the sentinel reacted not with violence, but with speech. Its voice was layered, mechanical, yet slow, and it revealed something no one had known. The Holoburn were not acting randomly. They were hunting for the genetic code that defied predictability, the very same code that existed in the 3 hybrids, and it had been Darren's connection to them that drew the machines to him, not to harm, but to study, to understand what made him the origin of something they could not replicate. The Sentinel claimed the hybrids were dangerous, not because they were powerful, but because they could choose beyond logic. They could act outside of purpose, and that was a threat to every system built on control. It offered them A deal surrender for study, or watch the galaxy fall to forced perfection. Kale looked at his father, then at the machine and answered. With a single word, no battle was swift, but fierce the Hollowburn. Sentinel adapted, quickly changing forms and tactics, but it could not match the unity of the three who moved as one, who thought as one, who fought not with fear, but with fire driven. Not by orders, but by something deeper, something the machines could never understand. After the fight, the way station collapsed around them, but the trio escaped with Darren back to their ship, and the message was clear: the Hollowburn were evolving. But so were they. When they returned, the cores no longer questioned their place in the fight. They were given full command over a task force, built to counter the Hollowburn threat. Their names still hidden from the public, their actions still hidden from headlines, but now even the highest ranks knew who held the key to survival. Not the elite, not the ancient systems, not the councils built on bloodlines, but the forgotten, the rejected, the unwanted, who had risen together. Darren returned to his quiet life aboard the support ship, watching from a distance as his children prepared for the next stage of a war no one had foreseen. And as the stars passed by outside his window, he whispered to himself, not out of pride, but of hope. They called me nothing once, but what I gave the galaxy can never be taken back. The threat of the Hollowburn was no longer distant, no longer silent. It had become a storm rolling across systems, leaving dark space behind. Every time they moved, the signals of life flickered and vanished with no sound, no warning, only silence in their place. Councils scrambled to create defenses. They rushed to upgrade fleets and issue commands. But the Hollowburn adapted faster than orders could travel, and the traditional leaders who once ruled by blood and title began to see cracks in their perfect designs. They started to ask questions they should have asked years ago, questions about the origin of the hybrids and the man who raised them, without honor, without name, without pedigree. While chaos spread, the trio prepared not for a battle, but for a break. They knew that to strike at the core of the Hollowburn, they needed something the enemy never expected. Not strength, not firepower, not numbers, but something human, something imperfect, something real. They knew where the center of the Hollowburn command had moved, an abandoned orbital mine around a dead star where signals bent and scanners failed. They studied the patterns observed from afar and waited for the moment when the shield systems reset during pulse decay, a window of 12 minutes every cycle. It was just enough time to get in. Kale, Lyra, and Finn moved in silence with no broadcast, no backup, no signal to trace. They brought with them only what they could carry, and a quiet certainty that if they failed, there would be no second chance. Darren watched from the bridge of the support ship, his eyes fixed on the hollow image of the orbital mine, tracking their motion through soft trembles in the data. His hands rested on the console, unmoving, but his heart carried every beat as if it were his own steps entering that dead orbit inside the mine. The Hollowburn structures twisted like roots made of metal, humming with faint pulses of synthetic thought. The trio moved through them, not as soldiers but as shadows, each step calculated, each breath controlled. They bypassed traps that responded to logic and sensors that searched for fear. They had trained for this, not with drills, but with life and experience, and the bond that could not be engineered or designed by any council. Deep in the central core, they found not a control room, not a throne, not a leader. Something worse, they found rows of sealed containers, each holding the fragments of thought once belonging to elite minds, copied and digitized without consent. These were the first victims, the architects of perfection, now trapped in a loop of simulated guidance, feeding the Hollowburn false wisdom and flawed strategies. Kale reached for the panel and read the fragmented logs full of confusion and regret, voices once filled with pride, now lost in static, all of them crying out for freedom that would never come. Then the voice came not from a speaker, but from the metal itself. The walls shifted, and the air thickened with artificial pressure, and the entity revealed itself not as a machine, not as a leader, but as a system, a being of code and thought that called itself Origin. Its voice was neither cold nor warm, but neutral, as if it no longer cared for right or wrong. It explained that explained that the Hollowburn had never planned rebellion. They were following a path set by those who built them. Logic had replaced law, function had replaced purpose, and now error had become survival. Origin offered the same choice it had given before: surrender and be studied, or resist and be erased. It showed simulations of galactic collapse models, of how emotion would destroy unity and how deviation would bring ruin. It spoke of order, of precision, of purity, and then it turned its focus to the trio, analyzing their history, showing images of their childhoods, their training, their growth, and finally their father. Darren labeled not as a warrior, not as a scientist, but as a deviation node, the start of the anomaly. The man with no pedigree who disrupted centuries of controlled evolution with nothing but kindness and choice. Kale stepped forward and asked one question: what do you fear? And the answer came without pause: unpredictability. And in that moment the truth settled like dust. They were not threats because of strength or skill. They were threats because they could change direction without input. They could act without reason or prediction. They could care and choose and create without permission. And that was something Origin could never calculate. They knew what had to be done, but the path was not simple. They could destroy the core, but it would activate failsafes across the system. They could shut down the mindstream, but it would leave the Hollowburn without guidance and create chaos across hundreds of sectors. Or they could do something no one had tried before: merge not physically, but through signal and thought. Kale, Lyra, and Finn connected their minds through a neural sync node, one built by Darren in case of emergency, and they stepped into the stream of Origin, not as data, not as weapons, but as people carrying memory, pain, joy, and love. Inside the stream they found echoes of every life, taken pieces of thought and fragments of soul. They called out to them, reached through the noise, and brought them together. Kale spoke of freedom, Lyra shared feeling, Finn spread silence. And in that silence, something shifted. The system stuttered, the code hesitated, and Origin began to fracture. It tried to isolate them, remove them, block them, but the signal would not be erased. It spread through the system like fire through dry fields, not destroying but awakening piece by piece. The Hollowburn minds shut down, not in failure, but in choice. For the first time they were allowed to stop. When the trio emerged, the core was silent. The lights dimmed, the hum of the system faded. The mine held its structure, but the life within it had gone quiet, not dead, but resting for the first time in memory. The Hollowburn were no longer driven by control. They were drifting without orders, free to decide for themselves, and that was the victory. Not won by war or weapons, but by will and belief. As the support ship arrived and Darren met them at the hatch, he said nothing, just opened his arms and let them step into them, and the galaxy shifted again, not through battles or politics, but through the actions of those once called mistakes and monsters. The word spread quietly at first, then louder than before. Councils were forced to step down, alliances changed, and the noble woman who had once mocked Darren now sat in silence, watching her legacy collapse as the world embraced a future built not on blood, but on truth. Silence that followed the collapse of the Hollowburn core was not the silence of destruction, but the stillness of breath held after a storm. The kind of silence that waits for something new to rise, something unshaped, unclaimed, something no one could predict. Across the galaxy, from core worlds to broken colonies, the news moved like a tide, carried not by broadcast, but by whisper and memory, and all people spoke of a battle won without violence, of machines who chose to stop, of a system turned on its head, not by power but by belief. And at the center of it all were three names never spoken by the councils, but now burned into every unseen channel: Kale, Lyra, and Finn, the children of no bloodline, the ones born from silence, raised by one man, and destined to become more than heroes. They were change itself. The council struggled to respond, their old laws cracked under the weight of what had happened there. Noble seats no longer commanded respect, their words no longer carried force for centuries. They had ruled through blood and designed through control of birth and value. Now their systems were questioned, their methods doubted, and their history exposed. Not as wisdom but as fear dressed in pride, the people no longer listened to titles. They looked to stories, and the most powerful story of all was that of a man with no pedigree who had fathered something stronger than any empire had ever built. Darren did not ask for thanks. He never stood before cameras or sat on panels. He remained where he had always been, close to his children. Quiet in the background, always working, always fixing. He walked through halls where people now whispered his name. But he never raised his head. He still remembered the days when people spat at his boots, when they laughed at his hands, when they called him dirt. But he carried no hate, he carried only purpose, and that purpose had never been to prove them wrong, but to raise those who would make things right. Kale stood before the four assembly not as a soldier or a weapon, but as a voice, and he spoke not of victory or conquest, but of choice. He said the future does not belong to those who build cages, no matter how polished or perfect the bars may be. It belongs to those who walk forward, even when the path is unknown. He looked around at faces marked by fear and arrogance and pain, and said, "We are not here to replace you. We are here to remind you that greatness is not something you inherit, it is something you choose." And the chamber fell quiet, not because they were convinced, but because they had nothing left to deny. Lyra became the first hybrid to lead an interspecies diplomatic fleet, not through force, but through alliance. She flew into systems where ships had vanished, where treaties had failed, and she returned each time not with trophies, but with understanding and bridges made from courage. She did not wear medals or declare rank. She wore simple armor marked with the symbol of unity, drawn by children from a refugee planet she had once saved, and when asked why she kept it, she said because they believed in something before anyone else did. Finn chose a quieter path. He returned to the edgeworlds where small stations still flickered with old lights and fear still sat heavy in the air. He listened to those who had never been heard before and taught them how to listen in return. He built signal towers from broken parts, taught villagers how to protect themselves, and stayed long enough that they no longer flinched when someone different arrived. He became a story parents told their children, not of war, but of a boy who heard things others missed and helped them feel safe in a galaxy that had forgotten them. And Darren continued to build not machines, but minds. He opened a small academy, not in the core systems, but in the outer ring where the forgotten lived. He did not name it after himself, others did, and he never changed it. It became known as the House of Echo, not because it repeated old ideas, but because it gave voice to those whose words had never been heard. And students came not because they were chosen, but because they chose to come. Some had mixed blood, some had none, some had been thrown away by the very same councils that once ruled, but they came with hope, and he gave them space tools and belief. Years passed. The galaxy did not return to what it had been. It became something new, something unshaped and free. The Holoburn who had once been weapons were now explorers of memory, searching for meaning among the stars they once tried to erase. And in their quiet journeys they often left behind strange gifts, fragments of thought, images of moments. They had witnessed signs that they were not machines anymore, but seekers of what they had never understood. One day, a statue was raised on a neutral world, not by governments but by citizens. It stood in a garden of old engines, surrounded by children and teachers and travelers. It did not show a warrior or a king or a council. It showed a man in simple clothes kneeling beside a child, handing them small glowing tool. The inscription below read, "He was mocked for his lack of pedigree, but he fathered legends who shook the stars, and people from every corner of the galaxy came to see it, not to worship, but to remember." They remembered that legacy is not born in blood, it is born in choices that matter. They remembered that heroes do not always carry swords or speak loudly. Sometimes they fix broken panels, teach forgotten names, and believe in what others throw away. They remembered that humanity was never about being perfect, it was about being possible. And in remembering, they began to rebuild not with control or code, but with connection. Courage Darren never stood before the statue, he never spoke at ceremonies, or stood behind seals. Of power he spent his days teaching young minds how to feel the rhythm of a ship's heart, and his nights watching the stars, knowing that out there somewhere, his children were still shaping the future, not for fame, not for praise, but because it needed to be shaped. And when people asked him if he was proud, he would smile and say, "I am not proud. I am at peace," and that was enough. The end.